Thank you very much, Professor Zhang. 大家平安。大家好。Good afternoon. 真感谢咱邱教授的这个介绍。今仔日呢，会当转来母校啊，母校我真久啊，60当前啊，60当前。当然讲有机会叫大家分享讲一本《Human Rights and World Order》的这本册。我是感觉讲，首先来感谢你的邀请，讲叫台湾新世纪文教基金会做伙合办今仔日这个新册发表会。同时呢，讲咱叶教授、翁教授、今仔日拢会当来遮做commentator，算是廖福特较嗲会来调，真欢喜。就较早咧讲最近台湾有通过讲国语甲母语的即个法律啦，我看说是真好，就是讲对语言的即个尊重。所以在即款场合呢，什么语言拢会当来像阮台湾新世纪文教基金会咧举行即个讨论的时阵，就是讲咱遮党员拢会当有即个自由，通家己决定要用什么语言安尼。较着我要讲主要是用英语啦，就是讲英语的时阵，这本册是用英语写的吼，用英语写，所以用英文来那个表现，当然比较方便。所以我刚才讲的就是说，在经过60年之后，再回来到母校，其实两年前也有一本《U.S.-Taiwan-China Relationship in International Law》那一本书。不过呢，这一次的书比较分量比较大，你看，所以反正就是说，我非常高兴回到母校来。那么我现在就是说，把这个书啊。要介绍一下子，那么这个书一共有1136页，所以在40分钟里头要介绍是一个 big challenge，but I'll try at least try to highlight what you don't really want to be scared by the I understand when I received the book, I wondered how heavy it was. And a person measured for me said it's 5 pounds. I said, no wonder so heavy. But you really don't decide a book by its weight. So what I would like to do really start from, it's sort of give you a brief background of this book. Originally, this book, Human Rights and World Public Order, the Basic Policies of the International Law of Human Dignity, was published by Yale University Press in 1980. And my co-authors, Professor Myers McDougall and and Harold D. Laswell, they were my mentors when I was at Yale writing my doctoral dissertation. They were the supervisors and my readers of the dissertation. And then I stayed on at Yale Law School as a research associate, senior research associate, and writing books. The first book I wrote was with Harold Laswell on Formosa, China, and the United Nations, published in 1967. And then later on, the next year was supposed to be international human rights law. And McDougall and Laswell said, well, this is International Human Rights Year. We need to do something, especially McDougall Laswell, as the founders of the New Haven School. they have been preaching human dignity for everybody, international law of human dignity, and so invited me to co-author with them. I said, of course, it was a great honor to do so, and I certainly was much delighted. But I think we did maintain our regular, we call a free association. 3 of us, and occasionally Michael Reisman would join us in discussion of what should be the scope of the book and what should be the structures and so on and so forth. And I will take notes and go over those. But in those days, I was distracted by the issue of Taiwan. that took lots of time from me. That was a very critical years in terms of whether Taiwan can eventually become a member of the United Nations and so forth. But anyway, the book was delayed publication. But finally, when China was seated in the UN and so forth, I faced with a choice. Should I continue to be a political activist in the fashion of a Vietnam War at the time? Scholars also get very much actively involved in all very real political issues, which affect everybody in a sense. Or I should really focus on completing the human rights book. And I had a very soul-searching time. I said, well, I am a scholar. I sort of excel in scholarship. And I don't think I will be the type of people who could really do politics and scholarship at the same time. When I have to make a choice, I said, whatever contribution to fulfill myself or to make contribution to Taiwan or to the world community, probably to be an international scholar, international human rights in particular should be something I ought to focus on. So once I was able to focus on it, I was able to accelerate the whole progress of completing the book. And at the time I thought, unless I finish the human rights and public order book with McDougall-Laswell, I will never get my freedom. And when we finished it, Professor McDougall said, don't you, this is only the first volume. We have a more volume plan. We want to cover all the values and so forth. I said, well, Mac, I call him Mac. Professor McDougall liked to, his student call him Mac. I said, Mac, if I only have 9 lives, and I already devoted one to this, and my mother-in-law staying with us at the time, visiting us, said, you know, your kids are growing and so on. As a research associate, I enjoy my study, research, and so forth. But in terms of salary, was much lower than teaching job and so forth. But anyway, I got the book completed, and then later on was able to join Professor McDougall after retirement from Yale to New York Law School, and he persuaded me to join him at the New York Law School and so forth. And that's why I from transition there. But to make a long story short, I think it's only 40 minutes. I would say this book in 1980 was published by the Yale University Press. In those days, Yale University Press published a series of books on international law by McDougall, Laswell. They were the 2 architects of what is called New Haven School of International Law, also known as the Yale School of International Law. As you may know, New Haven, Connecticut is where Yale University is located. That's why we have this notion of this name about New Haven School. So this was the first part. The original edition was published in 1980. And with the passage of time, the book was out of date and so forth, even though it was considered to be a classic in the field of human rights, but you really need to update it. And whatever, well, my mentors, Harold Laswell passed away in 1978 before the book was published by Yale Press. So McDougall and myself had to write something memoriam. And then Professor McDowell passed away in 1998 while I was in Taiwan at the time, just starting the Taiwan New Century Foundation. And so I was sort of commuting between Taiwan and the United States. But anyway, the second edition of the book, we call second edition or new edition, was published in Oxford, said in the United States was 2018, last year. The book was available in December. But in UK and other places of the world, it's 2019. So the book was officially really published in this year. So I was very glad to just keep these preliminary remarks about it. Perhaps I was asked whether I need to have a PowerPoint, but I didn't know I have to hold this and also look at my outline. Let's see. All right, I will just explain about the new edition. New edition certainly, first of all, republish the original edition in 1980 in its totality. That is to say, it includes the front matter, the text, the footnotes, indexes for case, name index, and the subject index in its entirety. And in this regard, I was extremely grateful to Oxford University Press. They said that this is a classic in the field. We are not going to shortcut, shortchange it, and so on. We want to publish it in entirety. And so we kept it in terms of a pagination, footnotes, and everything in the original form. And in addition, I wrote a new preface for the new edition, and also a new introduction to highlight significant developments in international human rights law since 1980. And the book really was, this new introduction was completed last year, so it really took account of the past 30 years, 8 years development. And so also we added some tributes to McDowell and Laswell, published at Yale Law Journal, in Yale Law Journal, and we got the permission to have those, and I thought it really added a great deal to it. And so this is what we have, a new introduction and the original text in its entirety, and I think the whole purposes of publishing it with the new introduction is to make sure that the important contributions, their wisdom by McDowell Laswell, the architect of the New Haven School, will be passed on to new generations, to future generations. If you look at the book's jacket here, a review by Michael Riesman, he said this book is really timeless. And McDowell Laswell, they try to write books in such a way not to be tied to any particular political ideology, tied to any historical period, but it would be for mortality. It will be used for a long, long time. And so I think that is something that this book is all about in terms of why it's an important contribution to the field. And so with this new introduction, certainly will make it possible for people to relate what the whole framework of inquiry developed by New Haven School in studying human rights by relating to contemporary events, contemporary cases and so forth, and especially for the future development. And the original edition, I already mentioned that the original edition certainly was done by employing the policy science approach of the New Haven School. Some people call it policy science approach, some people call it policy-oriented approach. And as I said, yeah, it's a New Haven School because Yale is located in New Haven. And I trust you all have a copy of the table of contents, don't you? I thought this is probably the best way to call your attention to some of the important features here. If you get your table of contents, you will see, start with the preface to the new edition, dedication from the original preface origin about the author, and tributes to the late co-authors. That certainly would be very worth reading in terms of how Professor McDowell's tribute to Harold Laswell. There were rather remarkable collaboration between McDowell and Laswell. McDowell in his time was called Mr. International Law, tremendous influence worldwide. And that was the prime time is the 1960s, 1970s. And Harold Laswell, if you have the chance to look at the book jacket or in some of the things you have.
We'll also distribute to the audience.
Yeah, by American Council of Learned Society, praised him as master of all the social sciences and pioneer in each. So I consider myself to be really very blessed and fortunate and privileged to be their disciples. And so we have theirs, and there was one item by Rosalind Higgins, and one by McDowell and Laswell, and then Michael Eastman, and then New Introduction to Human Rights and World Public Order. All these are numbered here in terms of Roman numeral to distinguish from the original edition. The original edition pagination is expressed in terms of Arabic number rather than Roman number. We will come back to this, but I think if you turn to this part 1, delimitation of the problem, you will see how broad the whole framework is, starting with this human rights in comprehensive context. What's the human rights in comprehensive context here? It's trying to see, when you talk about human rights, you don't talk about human rights protection, fulfillment in the abstract. You have to relate to human rights in the real life realities. And that means when you have this human rights in comprehensive context, New Haven School perceive and define human rights in terms of the shaping and sharing of all values. Values are what people cherish, what people pursue. And so all these values, for the purposes of a comparative studies across national boundaries and across time, McDowell Laswell developed what is called 8 values. 8 values are respect, power, enlightenment, well-being, wealth, skill, affection, rectitude. Respect relating to human dignity, worth, freedom of choice, recognition, equality. Power in terms of influencing community decisions, whether the community is local or national and so forth. Well-being, enlightenment means gathering, processing, and dissemination of information. Well-being relates to, defines as health, safety, and comfort. wealth. We all know wealth in terms of possession, consumption, utilization of goods and services, control of the resources. Skills can be expressed in terms of vocational skills, art, sport, and so forth. Affection in the normal way with love, but it's more than just love, it's a friendship, it's a positive sentiments, and so on. Rectitude. Some people will use justice as a way, but it does really take into account religious, moral, and legal dimension into account in terms of formation and expression of the norms of the responsible conduct. And if we want to another word, justice is close to it, but what is emphasized is whatever communities you may talk about, whatever cultures you may talk about, these are basic values. And when we talk about human rights, we are not talking about human rights in the abstract. It's really out of this. People demand you demand affection, you demand enlightenment, and so forth. And these are, I think, throughout you'll find. And so the framework here is guided in terms of human rights in comprehensive context, relating to the most comprehensive context. We talk about the global community. Human rights not just for any particular group or in particular country or particular region, but humankind as a whole. As human beings, we cherish something, we pursue all these. Here you have this question of, we have demands, and then the question of whether these demands are fulfilled, are realized, or fall short. And that we have what is called, this whole thing have to be related to the social setting in terms of the processes of deprivation and non-fulfillment. And there we have participants, perspectives, and so forth. All those go through. So it really starts when you have a human rights, whether human rights are that which only given, or human rights really improve more than what is actually protected. But the human beings make demands all the time. You can look at, in terms of sexual equality, for instance, or the marriage and so on. You see, when you have, in the United States, for instance, when you achieve racial equality, gender equality comes up, and then all the different groups make demands. And make demands, are these human rights only that which are already in the book and to be implemented, or are you going to take into account aspiration of the people? They make aspiration first. They may all start with writing an article, but they will turn to appropriate authoritative decision makers for help. Say, oh, we need this legislation and so forth. And this is why human rights here is used in a very dynamic sense, not something static. And this is why not only what is already in the book of 6 codes, but it really goes much beyond that. And then there is this claims made to authority for the protection of human rights. People make claims, but become claimants. They really said now certain rights are so important, they must be protected. And they promote it and so forth. And here you will find that this is an important one. And then this is chapter 4, the global constitutional process, authoritative decision. This is Roman numeral, page 15, and in the original book 161. Here is really something New Haven School has emphasized. When we were starting to write on human rights, we went through, especially myself, as a junior author, you read everything, you have to do it that way. And when I look back in terms of the footnotes in the book, I said, my God, did I read so many books and so forth? And at the time, I really was very fortunate. Yale has very wonderful book service. Like I said at least 200 books I need, and then the library would deliver to my office in those book cards, 2 cards or 3, and then some of the books I read very closely, and some of them they make reference to certain chapters and so forth, and that. And this is why I thought it's so valuable to have those very detailed footnotes. If you read, for instance, the chapter on sex-based discrimination, at that time the United Nations was in discussion of whether there should be a convention on the elimination of discrimination against sex, comparable to International Convention on the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. And I said, my God, when I look those literatures in anthropology, in sociology, and so on, those were the days women has her own place, men have their own place, and certain works only open for women, some for men, and so forth. So I thought of the preservation in the new edition in terms of original text. Those footnotes are extremely valuable. In fact, that the President Rosalind Higgins, who became President of the International Court of Justice, when she reviewed the book, she said, we don't see this type of a quotation now in terms of detailed quotation and so forth. We have the whole social sciences in different branches and so on. And she said that she found it most useful, especially our name index in the book itself. Not only names quoted in the text, but those names appear in footnotes. Whatever their book or articles are cited, we quoted them. And we have that in the name index. And these days, you don't really see that even in the American publication. And in Taiwan, of course, index is not, it takes time and so forth. I think we hired one person to do it for many, many months, and I had to go over those again. But I think this is something for the constitutive process of authoritative decision. Here really expresses the model used by the New Haven School, that this is coming from anthropology, cultural studies, in terms of who are participants, what are their perspectives, their subjectivity, their demands, their identification, their expectations, and then where's the arenas of interactions, where do you turn to for help, and base values in terms of authority and control, strategies, the diplomatic strategy, the ideological strategy, economic strategy, military strategy, outcomes. Outcomes usually relates to what is called 7 decision functions, the intelligence function, the promoting function, the prescribing function, the prescribing function, the invoking function, the applying function, terminating function, appraising function. The whole idea is, for lawyers, you are more accustomed with what are the laws enacted and what are the judgments, enforcement. So emphasis generally is on the prescribing function, lawmaking function, and the applying function. But Harold Laswell, as a social scientist, he said that this is not quite enough. Before a law can be adopted, how do you go? You go to fact-finding. You need to gather information that we call the intelligence function. It's not just in the secret connotation sense, but in terms of gathering of information, processing, and disseminating of information. So this is what we call 7 decision functions by the New Haven School. And promoting function especially. When you want to have a law passed, you have scholars writing articles and so on, editorial and all those, that's the promoting function. And then prescribing function, you would find that's the legislative enactment of a law. But this promotion function is very important. You demand something. Yes, we do need this law to protect sexual equality. We need this law and so forth. And then the invoking function. After law is passed, can you invoke when your rights are infringed upon? And this is what in an open democracy, that's something really open to everybody. They can do it that way. And so that's the important part. And then coming to applying function. We say that all judges and enforcement, judgment and enforcement, we are very familiar with that as lawyers. But the thing is, yes, that is important, but we need to go beyond, like the terminating function, whether certain law is outdated, they need to be modified and so on, or to be rescinded. The appraising function here is whether law is adequate, whether law is sound or not. It's not the judges who can make that judgment. Yes, they make judgment, but the moment a decision is rendered, scholars, students, editorial writers, opinion makers, they can criticize it. In the United States, we have Roe v. Wade about women's abortion, women's control of their body, and so forth. Even up to this day, continue to be an issue. Some people say Roe v. Wade should be terminated totally. Some people, well, should be restricted and so on. Still controversial. And Supreme Court of the United States said, yes, we may be the supreme, but we are not the final one. The moment they make a final decision, that the decision is open to appraisal by students, by professors, by opinion writers, and so on. So when you talk about all these decision functions, it becomes very meaningful in terms of lawmaking and law execution, application, are not confined to governmental officials, individual persons, civic organizations, like in the United States, ACLU, plays a very important part in all this. And this is why this is part of what the New Haven schools try to emphasize. And so you get the idea. Here, when we talk about the whole question of implementation of human rights, it's not confined to whether certain enforcement is secure. You really have to relate to the whole continuing processes. New Haven School really emphasized this process. Define laws not just a body of static rules, but law, especially international law, as a continuing process by which the members of the community clarify, identify, and secure their common interest, which is critical. And in this regard, when we look down in terms of how these decision-making functions are performed, it's very important. You have to give me a little, if time comes close. I think it's probably too much to canvas. I better, then when you...
We have last 3 to 5 minutes.
Oh, only that?
Yeah.
Oh.
But I enjoy too much. It's like back to the times of a student.
Well, I think I will try to wrap it up before. Okay, and then classification of a policy. These really, well, I think it's a little hard to make it for.
We can have a little extra, but yeah.
No, that's okay. I'll try to. I will just summarize New Haven School because the original text and the new edition both are written by employing the New Haven School. And the New Haven School certainly does not conceive law as just a body of static rules. So that these are rules in this 6 code. That's law. But I think New Haven School is interested in not only those norms, those rules, but in terms of viewing law as a continuing process by which the members of the world community identify, clarify, and secure their common interests. Common interests are key, and also it's a very dynamic nature. And so the New Haven School, to characterize generally, it is contextual. It is problem solving, and it is multi-method. Contextual in the sense, law and society are inseparable. You want to see law in action? Yes. And so you need to relate this legal process in the larger context of the community. Community could be local community, national community, regional, and even global community. And so it is something that has to be perceived in that sense. And then problem solving. The jurisprudence, this New Haven School really is type of jurisprudence, theory of law. How are you going to deal with problems? You are not just describe something, but to try to see how legal problems can be solved in such a way the values of the community will be fulfilled, so that in the aggregate, the law has its own function, has its own purposes, and law well managed will contribute to the building of a better society, free society, society of human dignity and security. And next step is multi-method. It's a policy-oriented, it's a problem-solving. If you're going to solve a problem, what methods should you use? Do you use only logic, or do you use semantics? The idea is you need all the intellectual skills coming from different disciplines. And here, for instance, would include a clarification of goals. What are the important goals you try to do, to develop? And that, of course, can differ from different levels, from abstract to concrete situations. And then what is also known as the description of the past trends. As lawyers, we always ask, has there been decision, and what has been a particular clause, particular rule being interpreted, and so on. And then another step is not just what has happened in the past, but what are the important factors that affect certain decisions. And this is a task of a scientist, social scientist, or otherwise. And then projection of a probable future developments. Problem solving is future oriented. The moment you talk about solving certain problem, well, there are some factors that can be anticipated. Trends of decision, historians do that all the time, lawyers do that all the time. Probable future development, that really was highlighted, dramatized by futurists. They said, well, to the extent possible, you try to anticipate what may. And then the ultimate goal is, what will be the invention, evaluation, and recommendation of alternatives? Yes, you want to solve the problems. How would you define a problem? I asked a student. Easy definition given by Lasso is, problem is a distance between aspiration and gap. You try to get an A, but you get up only C. And then you begin to ask why I didn't get the A and end up in C. And you have a personal factors and so on, and you have your factors and so forth. But the whole idea, all these intellectual skills need to be systematically explored and utilized to enhance the maximum protection. Yeah, okay. And then I think I need to highlight the new edition, new introduction. If I may invite you to take a look, the first page of the contents there. There's a new introduction to human rights and world public order. The changing context of conditions, expanding concept of human rights. This here is one, there what is called 3 generations of human rights. The first generation generally considered civic and political rights. Second generation, economic, social, and cultural rights. And the third generation of human rights is called human rights in terms of human solidarity rights. You really talk from the aggregate, from perspective of the community. And I think for Americans, you know, they usually all human rights are just attached to individual human rights. But when a community, and these are what are sort of solidarity rights, human stuff. These third generation rights are very easy example, like self-determination. For people to self-determination, you need the whole collectivity to act on it. Or if you want to right to health, right to have a clear, healthy environment, you cannot do it by yourself. It's not just individuals' efforts at all. The community itself, you have to raise all the consciousness to make sure that is. And here you have that notion as a good example. Right to livable environment, and then most importantly, I think, right to peace. Right to peace really is the totality of what it would be. And then, you know, some of the questions I mentioned in passing, we can still have time for discussion. And concept of human security. Human security, I thought that all these, this human security concept has become very important in McDowell Laswell's earlier rights. They talk about minimum world order and optimum world order. Minimum world order in the sense minimization of coercion and violence, unauthorized coercion violence, and optimum world order in terms of optimum enjoyment, shaping and sharing of all values. And these two together really what the peace in the positive sense is about. And I thought, since the human beings will be directed, this notion of human security makes a lot of sense. So I expound this quite a bit. And for instance, toward the world community of human dignity and human security, both the emphasis to respect the inherent right of the individual and to also the aggregate community. And so this is an important one. And then a comprehensive global bill of human rights. This is something I think in terms of all those decision, prescription, invocation, and so forth. Processes of authoritative decision and effective power as well. New Haven School does emphasize law is not a pure law. Yes, law it must not be dominated by politics, but the political factors do affect, and this is why, especially international law and international politics are closely related. But as lawyers, of course, we said the law is paramount, but we need to be aware of those factors that affect. And I think in this regard, there are 7 decision functions of intelligence, promotion, invocation, prescription, application, termination, appraisal, all those help. And then another very important feature is from state sovereignty toward state responsibility. You cannot engage in genocide and human rights deprivation. If you deprive human rights, if you engage in wholesale deprivation of human rights, that rulers cannot justify its legitimacy. And here I think it's finally said you cannot invoke sovereignty as a way to suppress your people. If you oppress, suppress, systematically engage in deprivation of human rights of individuals, it's a matter of concern for the whole entire human society. And that means it's certainly a matter of international concern, not a domestic jurisdiction matter, and which is a very important development. And then individual criminal responsibility. And I think this is what those special tribunals established by United Nations Security Council relating former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, or Cambodia for that matter, and crystallized in International Criminal Court. Now it's a permanent judicial body to make sure political leaders are held accountable. If they're engaging gross violation of human rights, they must be held accountable. And then really in terms of this vital role of civil society, this is why in the field of human rights, so many non-governmental organizations are so active, which is very important. And what distinguishes a democratic society is in terms of to what extent people are free to engage in group association to promote their common cause, to seek common good for their people, themselves and otherwise. So this is a very important part of, vital part of civil society for human rights. And I conclude here with a grand strategy of mobilization and simultaneity. I think in the final analysis, individual human beings do count, and individual human beings within Taiwan or elsewhere, they need to be concerned with what kind of a human rights deprivations, human rights non-fulfillment they encounter. If they want to change their situation, of course they have to make effort. And what can you do? Ultimately, from the perspective of changing people's perspective, I think education is fundamental. We need to educate people, but education in the most comprehensive sense, not education in the formal classroom setting. That's important. But beyond that, I think civic education of all forms will be critical. So I would use this as a sort of concluding note.